One of the biggest questions I get here on the channel is people ask me, Daniel, what do I do if I have footage inside of my project that was either filmed at different resolutions or at different frame rates? What am I supposed to set my project for? How do I handle it? What should I be aware of? There is one really big truth that I don't think nearly enough educators talk about. If you have no idea how your footage was recorded, you'll have no idea how it's going to behave inside of your edit. And these behaviors can be anything from pixelated footage that doesn't look very crisp to audio that starts to lose its sync with the video and start to drift off. All of these things can start to happen when you start using mixed frame rates and mixed resolutions inside of your project. Now, as a rule of thumb, I always try to film whatever I'm filming and screen capture from all my different sources at a preset resolution and frame rate before I ever start my project. This project I'm filming and capturing at 4K UHD, and everything is going to be at 30 frames per second. All my footage will be filmed at that resolution and frame rate. I will keep my project and timeline settings at that resolution and frame rate. And when I go to export, I will export at that resolution and at that frame rate. That will make sure that my footage looks as good as it can possibly look when I export it from DaVinci Resolve. Now, bitrate does come into play, but I'm not going to talk about that a lot today. Just make sure that whatever you captured or filmed your footage at for a bitrate, when you export from the deliver page, you keep an equally high bitrate in the advanced settings so you don't lose any of that quality. But let's focus on resolution and frame rate, because a lot of times what happens, even if we try our hardest, we'll end up with footage in a project that's at different resolutions and different frame rates. So let's start with resolution. What is resolution? What we're talking about is the amount of pixels in any given image for its size or shape. So the question becomes, what's a pixel? A pixel is basically just a small square of information, color information, things like hue, saturation, brightness, and it's condensed into one block of information. And all those little blocks together are what make up a frame, and many frames together is what makes up your video. Whenever you see a resolution defined by two sets of pixel numbers, it's always going to be the width first and the height second. This particular video was filmed in 4K UHD, 3840 wide by 2160 tall. Now, if I were filming in HD 1080p, that would be 1920, 1920 pixels wide by 1080 pixels tall. And if you do different shapes such as square, if you had a square piece of footage, it would be 1080 pixels wide by 1080 pixels tall. That's still considered 1080p. And if you do vertical format like short form reels or TikTok videos, those numbers will be reversed. The narrower number is first because it's taller than it is wide, and that might be in HD 1080p by 1920. That's still considered 1080p. We're always going to reference the narrowest of either dimension. What does that mean in the real world when we're putting different resolutions into one project? Well, that depends. Let's say that you had a project and the project settings and timeline settings were set to HD, meaning your project resolution, your timeline resolution is set to 1080p. Now, if that's a 16:9 format, you might have some 4K footage, which is 3840 by 2160. When you bring that into your project, now your software, in this case DaVinci Resolve, has to figure out what to do with those pixels. The amount of pixels in that footage in each frame is basically figured out by multiplying those two numbers together. If your 4K footage is 3840 by 2160, multiply those two numbers together, and you get just about 8 million pixels in any given frame of that video. If your footage is filmed in 16:9 1080p, kind of the same shape but lower resolution, then you would multiply those two numbers together and you get right around 2 million pixels for every frame of the video in that particular clip. Now that's a pretty big difference. 2 million, 8 million, there are 4 times as many pixels in 4K as there are in 1080p, which is funny because sometimes you'll hear about 4K being twice the resolution of 1080. And realistically it is, because if you look at the outside dimensions, 1080 multiplied by 2 is 2160. And if you look at the other dimension, the width, 1920 multiplied by 2 is going to give you 3840. So it physically is twice the amount of pixels wide and twice the amount of pixels tall. But when you multiply them together and you fill the center, that's actually 4 times as many pixels. And that can be super important when you start figuring out how your software is going to handle that footage. If we bring 4K footage into a 1080 HD timeline and project, DaVinci Resolve is going to look at that footage and break it down by pixels. And basically for every 1 pixel of 1080p, you're going to have 4 pixels in the 4K footage. So what does Resolve do with those pixels? Well, what it does is it looks at all the information from all four, and it sort of composites them together into one new pixel using the information from all four. Now, it won't be quite as crisp as 4K, but it is going to be using a large data set of 4 different pixels worth of information to come up with this one new pixel it's going to use in the 1080p project. So a lot of times when you bring 4K footage into a 1080p project, it'll look better than the 1080p footage because it's just using more information at the source to come up with the final image. Now, if you reverse that, let's say you bring 1080p footage into a 4K project and timeline. Now, DaVinci Resolve is looking at fewer pixels to try to figure out how to fill that space. That means it'll only have one source pixel for every 4 pixels it needs for the resolution of the project. So what it's going to do is take that one pixel, split it into 4, and replicate it. That's what we call scaling up the footage, which is very different than upscaling, and we'll talk about that after. And because it's not improving the quality of those pixels, it's replicating them. When you zoom in, you can still see pixelation, and you can see artifacts in the same way that you would if you zoomed into 1080p. It's not improving the quality of that footage. Now, if you are using the studio version of Resolve, they do have a feature called AI superscaling that actually will look at that singular pixel and try to create more pixels from it that are a little more data rich, and it's using AI to figure that out. And it'll make that footage a little more crisp, a little more clear, and physically upscale it to feel more like 4K footage. One thing I always warn people about is that process makes those files much more intense in terms of their size, and the process of doing that uses up a lot of system resources. So I try not to use a lot of AI superscaling, only in those few situations where I've got like a 4K project and I happen to have a 1080p piece of footage or even lower resolution, and I'm trying to improve it to look a little bit better in my high resolution project. Your best bet is always to have your source material be filmed all at the same resolution, and you won't have to worry about any of this stuff in your project. I know sometimes you just can't help it. If you're working with HD footage, 1080p, typically you would bring that 1080p footage in, set your project and timeline resolution for 1080p, and you would export at the same 1080p. But there are times where actually changing that can come into play, and YouTube is actually one of those places. They have different compression algorithms they use on different footage, meaning they open up more bandwidth for higher resolution formats. If you actually have a 1080p project and you export it at 2K or 4K, a higher resolution, it's not going to improve the quality of the footage. But when YouTube sees it as higher resolution footage, what they'll do is they'll open up a different compression algorithm that gives you more bandwidth, and your 1080p footage will actually look better than other people's 1080p footage because YouTube is thinking it's 4K and giving it a little more room to breathe and a little more love when it gets uploaded to YouTube itself. So that's one of those rare exceptions where you might want to change the export resolution settings and go a little bit higher to get a little bit more quality out of the hosting platform your video might end up on. Now, the other part I get asked about all the time is frame rate and mixed frame rates within your project. This one gets a little more in depth. There are all different types of frame rates that you can film at or capture at. There are sub-frame rates that are just below 60 and 24 that you might see in some cameras, and I won't go into the reason why there are all these different frame rates, but in general, it's more of an application thing. Some people think that higher frame rates are more crisp or have more detail, and that's kind of true, but it really has to do more with shutter speed. You can get an absolutely crisp looking piece of footage shot at 30 frames per second if you have a very fast shutter speed. If you slow down the shutter speed and it's open for longer, you're going to get more motion blur. And a lot of times you'll hear people say that 24 frames per second is more cinematic. That's kind of true, but not necessarily. There are plenty of films that are shot in 30 frames per second, but slower shutter speeds. And the reason the shutter speed matters is if there's a slower shutter speed, it means it's going to take longer to bring in the amount of light, and you're more likely to see motion blur, and that more readily approximates what the human eye sees. If you turn your head really quickly, you'll see that things blur until you stop and focus on whatever you're looking at. That's what a slower shutter speed and sometimes a slower frame rate can approximate, that feeling of motion blur that your eye picks up. And you could still film at 60 frames per second with a slow shutter speed and have some of that motion blur too. But a lot of times you'll see sporting events where they're covering football or a similar sport, and they'll use a higher frame rate, but they use a very fast shutter speed because they want to catch every bit of the action along the way, and they don't want it blurred out or have you missing anything in the broadcast. But what happens when you bring different frame rate footage into one project? This is where it gets tricky. Let's say we have a project that's set for 60 frames per second in the project and in the timeline, and we bring in a piece of footage that's only 24 frames per second. Well, what software like DaVinci Resolve does is it looks at those frames and it has to interpolate them. What that means is it's going to look at the actual frame divisions of the project and then look at the frames in the footage and try to have them make sense. 24 frames per second is about 2.5 times fewer frames than 60 frames per second. So for every frame in a 60 FPS project, you're going to have these frames that sort of overlap multiple frames if you're using 24 FPS footage. So what Resolve is going to do is look at that and say, okay, let's take the first frame here and let's clip it right at the second frame mark of the project. Now we have one frame occupying 2 frames of the project itself because the project is set for a higher frame rate. Then it's going to take that frame and cut it in half. And it's basically duplicating that frame. So one frame is duplicated to occupy 2 frames worth of a 60 frame per second project. And then because not everything lines up perfectly as you go down the line, it's going to then look at the next section of 2 frames and decide which frame to pick, lengthen that frame so it fills that space, and then cut it in half. So you're going to have duplicate frames, 2, 2, 2, 2, and it's choosing frames from that 24 frames per second footage to make that happen. Now, sometimes you can see that when you take low FPS footage into a higher FPS timeline, you can see some choppiness or that interpolation happening. It's changing the information from the original footage, and it can look a little jittery or wobbly, and that's actually known as judder, Judder. And it has to do with that uneven spacing and trying to make the footage work in a higher frame rate project. Now, when you do the opposite, let's say you have a 24 frames per second project and you bring in 60 frames per second footage, it's doing the opposite maneuver. Now it has to look at, well, we've got more frames than we need for the amount of frames in this project. And what it's going to do is say, let's take the first frame from this section. We've got some extra frames. Let's cut there and drop the extras. And we'll just lengthen this one frame and stretch it out so that it fits that entire space. And then it'll move on to the second frame and say, well, we've got more frames than we need. It'll pick the earliest frame that makes sense, cut the rest out and stretch that out to fill, and it'll keep doing that through the project. So you're actually losing frames when you bring higher frame rate footage into a lower frame rate project, and when you bring lower frame rate footage into a higher frame rate project, it's duplicating or adding frames. But when you're cutting up the footage and losing frames, it can give a kind of a different look, a different choppiness, and that effect is actually called stutter. Now, the studio version of DaVinci Resolve has some features to help out with some of those situations. One of those features is called optical flow, and when you apply optical flow to either one of these situations, they act differently as well. If you have 60 FPS footage inside of a 24 FPS project, DaVinci Resolve is losing frames and then trying to do what it calls interpolating in between, and it might be trying to blend the motion from one frame to another. The optical flow option is actually pretty good at that because it has some pretty good data sets on either frame to work with and try to interpolate them to blend the motion in between. But if you have lower frame rate, like a 24 FPS footage in a higher frame rate project, what it's going to do is it's adding frames. And whenever the software has to add frames, it's kind of making up entire frames out of nowhere, and it's not quite as good at that. Now, there are some other problems that come along with changing the frame rates inside of a project. One of them is what we talked about, that stutter and judder, but another thing is you can actually lose your audio sync. And the reason is that audio that you originally captured along with your footage, it was captured to match the frame rate you filmed or screen captured at. So once you start changing those frames and dropping and cutting and sliding them around a little bit, you'll often see your audio start to drift or lose that sync. So one of the number one answers I give to people when they come to me and say, I don't know why my audio won't stay in sync. The first thing I ask them is, well, what frame rate did you film the footage in? Did you change it inside of your project? Is your project set to a different frame rate? Because those changes can really make a huge difference in the audio. Because as Resolve changes the footage to make the frames match and work in a different frame rate project or timeline, it's not changing the audio. It's just going for the overall length. And sometimes those things slide and drift off. Another big issue that people run into is they film a lot on their mobile devices using their phones. That's awesome, except a lot of phones use what we call variable frame rates, or VFR. So even if you set your phone to capture at 24 frames per second or 30 frames per second, it might drift in and out, a little bit less than 30, a little bit more than 30, at different points while it's filming. Why does it do that? Because phones are designed for performance. They don't care about editing. What they care about is when someone owns a phone, they want to make sure that the storage doesn't fill up too fast. They want to make sure that the battery doesn't drain too quickly. They want to make sure when people watch their footage back on their phone, it performs the way that phone expects it to perform. They care less about when you set it off to your editing software and you might want to start cutting that up and doing different things with the footage. Now, I definitely don't want to get into a pissing match about iPhones versus Android phones, but one thing you should be aware of is Apple iPhones do tend to have a better and more consistent variable frame rate flow. That's not a knock on Android. It's just that Apple builds Apple products. If you buy an iPhone, any iPhone, it's always going to be manufactured from Apple. Android phones are different. They license that out to all different manufacturers. So you can have Android phones from many different companies, and what they choose to do inside of their own phones and cameras is going to be very different depending on which manufacturer and which model you purchased. Which brings up the question of, well, how do I find the resolution and frame rate of the clips that I'm using when I bring them into the software? Well, when you first bring them into your system, you should be able to find the properties, whether you're on a Mac or a PC, that'll show you the properties of that particular clip. And you can find those things often inside of Resolve as well. When you bring a clip down into your timeline, you can open up the metadata in the upper right, and that'll show you some of the information about that clip as well. But one of the things that's hard to recognize is variable frame rate. A lot of different OSs and softwares don't necessarily list whether a piece of footage has a variable frame rate going on inside of it. It'll just list a constant frame rate that it was technically targeting, but not give you the VFR information. There are some third-party apps that allow you to analyze your footage and see if there's variable frame rate going on. I'll leave some links to those below. And there are some other softwares that allow you to take that variable frame rate footage and turn it into a constant frame rate footage. There are free options like handbrake.fr that allow you to take footage and you can transcode it into something with a constant frame rate before you bring it into your project. That can help with things like if you're having a little bit of audio drift or if you're having some judder or stutter somewhere in your project, even though your footage and your project are set to the same frame rate. Now, a lot of times the reason that you'll have a different resolution or frame rate is you're getting footage from other places than where you filmed or captured yourself, and you don't always control those frame rates and resolutions. But that's where you can really spend a little time in pre-production trying to find the right things that you'll need that will match your project. For instance, a lot of the B-roll that I use in my projects, I get from today's sponsor, Storyblocks. Now, when I go to Storyblocks and I start looking for some high-quality, high-resolution footage to use, they have filters that allow me to start filtering by the resolution. Do I want 4K? Do I want HD? And I can make those choices. I can also filter by the frame rate and only use footage that matches the frame rate of the project I'm building. So I don't run into a lot of these other issues along the way. And what I really like about Storyblocks is they don't play those pricing games. One price gives you unlimited access to as many assets as you need, as much high quality video as you need, as many sound effects as you need, as much music as you need for your project, as many images, as many DaVinci Resolve templates. All of that is included in your membership price, and there are no limits to how many you can download and use right now. If you're interested in learning more about Storyblocks, I'll leave a link down below and you can go check them out for yourself. Now keep in mind, sometimes people will say, I don't experience any of those problems. And often that's because they're not doing a lot with their footage. They're bringing it in, they might do a few cuts, a few transitions, and then they export it. Where you start to see more of these artifacts is people who start using a lot more mixed resolutions, a lot more mixed frame rates. And then they start doing things like applying retime controls and doing speed ramping and changing the speed of that footage, or doing a lot of animations where they zoom in close or zoom back out far. Those animations start to show some of the flaws in that interpolation. When it comes to resolution, when you zoom in, you're much more likely to see pixel distortion or pixelation, because when you zoom into something, you're looking at fewer pixels displayed on the screen. So if you plan on doing a lot of zooming in and moving around like I do in my particular tutorials, what I do is I make sure I always capture at a higher resolution and a higher frame rate, like 30 frames per second, and usually at 4K from a 4K monitor. So when I screen capture and then I need to zoom into a portion of DaVinci Resolve, that zoom feels kind of smooth and it should look kind of crisp even when I'm zoomed way in with fewer pixels. Now with all this information, that still leaves us with a lot of questions, like what's the right resolution I should choose for my project? What's the right frame rate I should choose for my project, especially when I have mixed frame rates and resolutions in the footage I'm using? Well, here's sort of the rule of thumb. If you have main footage, your main A-roll footage that's basically holding most of your video together, whatever frame rate and resolution that was filmed in, make that your project and timeline resolution and frame rate. And let your B-roll and smaller sections that you're using around it, if their resolution and frame rate isn't consistent with the project, then let DaVinci Resolve handle that. And let's make sure that your main footage, the one that you really want the viewer to pay attention to, defines the overall project and timeline settings so that you have the fewest amount of issues with the main footage. We covered a lot of things here today. But if you want to learn more about how to edit your footage in DaVinci Resolve, click on the video that I have on screen now or the ones that I'll link down below. Keep creating. Peace.